Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining today's webinar to learn more about animal source foods and child nutrition in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Uganda. My name is Hannah Kane, and I'm the Communications Specialist at the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Nutrition, and I'll be your MC today. As more attendees are joining the webinar, I will begin by going over some of the housekeeping. The Director of the Innovation Lab for Nutrition, Dr. Patrick Webb, will give a brief background on the Innovation Lab and our research, and then he'll begin the webinar by introducing today's moderator, Grace Namarembe. I would like to direct all the attendees to a few functions on this Zoom call. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat icon and a Q&A icon. Please use the chat feature to engage in relevant conversation with the other attendees. If you have a question for one of the panelists, please use the Q&A feature. Panelists will respond to questions in the QA as they are able to, but we have also allotted the final 20 minutes of this webinar for Q&A, at which point the panelists will respond to as many of the remaining questions as they can. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please send a message in the chat to Angie Colbert so that our technical support staff can work with you to help resolve any technical issues. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Innovation Lab for Nutrition and the USAID Advancing Nutrition websites. You can also register for upcoming webinars and view previous recordings and slide decks on our websites. I will repeat these technical housekeeping items in the chat throughout the webinar, as people may be joining in at later times. Thank you again for joining us today. And now I would like to introduce the Director of the Innovation Lab for Nutrition, Professor Patrick Webb. Professor Webb is the Alexander McFarland Professor of Nutrition at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy and the Principal Investigator of the U.S. government, or of the USAID's Food Aid Quality Review Project. In 2005, Professor Webb was the Chief of Nutrition at the United Nations World Food Program. He has served on numerous task forces and global advisory panels and is currently the Senior Advisor to the High-Level Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition. With that, let me ask Dr. Patrick Webb to take over and provide us with a brief description of the Innovation Lab for Nutrition. Dr. Webb, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Hannah, and welcome everyone. It's so great to have so many people, old friends and new, joining us for this latest in our webinar series, which you can see the whole series on our website of nutritioninnovationlab.org. I myself am having technical difficulties. The tropical storm Isaias has knocked out my power since yesterday afternoon, so I'm on the phone. And so things may be a little bit fuzzy, and who knows how long my battery will survive. But there we go. These things present challenges. The Nutrition Innovation Lab, very briefly, an important activity of what was the Bureau of Food Security is now Bureau of Resilience and Food Security within USAID, and part of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab suite of institutions and centers around the world. Ours focuses on food, diets, and nutrition, and our goal, and you can see the map here of the many different countries, mainly in South Asia.
Dr. Webb, I think we lost your audio right there. Dr. Ghosh, can I actually have you jump in while we resolve some of the audio issues on Dr. Webb's side?
Sure, absolutely. Do you want to, I don't think he's able to hear us either, right?
Correct. I'm gonna, yeah, his audio is still not working. I'll have you jump in with this section while we resolve some of these issues.
Yes, yes, thank you, Hannah, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. I think Patrick has just realized that we are not able to hear him, and I think he isn't able to hear us either, so I'm speaking, Patrick. And yeah, Got it. I think he's figuring it out. Maybe, there he goes. We'll give him a minute to see if his audio reconnects, everyone. We apologize. Patrick, are you back?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yes?
Go ahead, yes.
Sorry, no idea why that happened, but there we go. So next slide, please. I was simply saying that this range of research activities around the world could not be done with a huge number of global and national and local partners, hopefully most of whom are here, core partners with whom we've worked from the very beginning of the Innovation Lab 10 years ago, Purdue, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Tuskegee, as well as Columbia and UC Davis, but a range of important institutions in the countries in which we work. And for this particular presentation, Makerere University in Uganda, the Bangladesh Agricultural University in Bangladesh, obviously, and Tribhuvan and Patan Academy of Health Sciences in Nepal have all been extremely influential partners. I have to also point out NGOs like Heifer International who've played an important role. So we are using this series of webinars to share recently published or soon to be published findings so that we can get policy and program relevant information out to the community as quickly as possible and get feedback on the discussion of implications. So with that, I'm going to hand to the moderator for this particular webinar, Grace Namarembe, who will carry on with the order of play for this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick. All right, so in this webinar, we will examine the role of animal source foods in improving the nutritional status of vulnerable populations and present findings from the Innovation Lab for Nutrition Studies in Nepal, Uganda, and Bangladesh. Let me first introduce the other two speakers today and then provide a brief summary of the sequence of presentations. So Dr. Shibani is a research associate professor at Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. She's also the associate director for the Innovation Lab for Nutrition with experience working in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. Her research interests are in understanding the role of agriculture in improving nutrition while ensuring health, assessing the diet and non-diet determinants of nutritional status of infants and young children, and testing interventions aimed at improving maternal and infant nutrition and growth. Dr. Sonia Zaharia is a postdoctoral fellow at the Nutrition Innovation Lab with a background in economics. Her interest lies at the intersection of economics, agriculture, and nutrition with the aim of finding sustainable solutions to global food security. She has a Master of Science in Sustainable Food Systems from Wageningen University and a PhD in Finance from Goethe University in Frankfurt. And now for the sequence of presentations. Dr. Ghosh will start the webinar sharing evidence of the role of ASFs in improving nutritional status of young children, including prior work by Nutrition Innovation Lab. She will be followed by Dr. Zaharia, who will present new analyses which examine the link between anthropometric outcomes of children and their previous and current consumption of animal source foods. Finally, Professor Webb will complete the panel presentations by responding to a major question as to whether agriculture or multi-sector interventions improve the intake of ASFs in settings where diets are already lacking diversity. And then we will all come back together and answer any remaining questions. As Hannah mentioned earlier, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions to the panelists. We will be monitoring this feature throughout the webinar and answering any questions that may come up. Any remaining questions will be answered during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. And without further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh, over to you.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you for a very gracious introduction. Welcome everybody from very many different time zones. We really appreciate you coming on, especially if it's very early in the morning on your end or very late in the evening as well. So let me jump in into the overall topic of animal source foods. And I think all of us on here are probably very familiar with these 3 bullet points that are on my first slide here. That is, animal source foods are a source of highly bioavailable protein, iron, vitamin A, zinc, and iodine. So that's well proven. And that also, if it's eaten in small quantities, they do provide these vital nutrients, particularly for infants and young children. Of course, there is a question of whether all the nutrients would be provided, but at least that they provide bioavailable forms of those nutrients. And that provision of these ASFs in small quantities is an important food-based intervention. And this is not just to ensure the growth, as in physical growth of children, but also their cognitive development. And I want to place particular emphasis on cognitive development because I think that that is the place that we really need to be looking at in terms of improving cognitive development of young children. Next slide, please. Thank you, Hannah. So what I want to begin with first is what I like to look at as a nutritionist stroke quasi-dietitian is what is the composition of animal source foods? And what you have here is the value of these different nutrients per 100 grams. And I've just chosen a few examples of raw foods. These are from the USDA Food and Nutrient Database. Next slide, please. And what you see here, I've highlighted, is that you do find differences in the nutrient value, whether it's the energy, and in this case, I've highlighted protein, fat, calcium, iron, and vitamin B12. So these are very critical nutrients, as we know, for young children, and these are present in variable quantities in these different animal source foods. So not all animal source foods are alike, but they all bring value to the table. Next slide, please. On the flip side of that is the discussion of animal source foods as being unhealthy foods. And we are very aware of the discussions around the unhealthy nature of animal source foods, not only for individual health, but also for planetary health. And for those of you who haven't looked at this, I would recommend the Eat Lancet Commission on Healthy Diets for Sustainable Food Systems piece, which really highlights the importance of looking at animal source foods from the perspective of it being an unhealthy food. And then the other piece that comes along with that is the fact that we don't actually classify animal source foods as unhealthy or healthy, or for that matter, it's really hard to do that because they bring in such they have such nutrient dense value, but they also have the element where if they're consumed in large quantities, they could be, they're not beneficial, particularly for certain populations. But for the purpose of this presentation and for this webinar, we are looking at animal source foods in small quantities that are quite vital and critical for the growth and development of young children. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first question one wants to ask is, do type and number of ASFs matter? And what do we know about the research in the realm of the type of ASF provided and its effect on growth? And there have been, if you look at the literature, there is a lot that has been discussed around animal source foods. And the discussion that has begun from the early 1900s or even earlier, and some of you might be even more familiar and aware of literature that goes back further in time. This particular slide shows the sort of advertisement that was used from the British Medical Research Council study that was conducted on the diet of boys during the school age, where they found conclusively that cow's milk intake did improve the growth of these boys. And that sort of led the mandate for milk consumption to be included in for schoolboys and schoolgirls in Britain. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, who is doing the slides? Thank you. Yeah. So coming closer to time, so I've kind of gone back to the 1920s, but if you come closer to time, you do find ecological and multi-country analysis where the relationship of intake of ASFs, whether the quantity, the quality, the number of ASFs has been correlated with specific nutrition outcomes. And in this slide, I'm looking only at those studies that looked at stunting as a outcome measure, which is one of the primary outcome of interest, if you will. And without going into major details, these 4 studies, the first 2 studies were using 2 different data sets. And so they have a very ecological level at the national level, looking at the quality of the ASF and its association with stunting or its association with DALYs or disability life adjusted years linked to stunting in children under 5. And the last 2 studies, which are the second 2 bullets, are focused on using demographic health survey data, where they looked at the consumption of ASF and the number of ASFs in the past 24 hours and the probability of being stunted. And essentially, what was found was 3 types of ASFs, egg, meat, and dairy, were highly correlated with lower risk of stunting. Next slide, please. So it's fine when we're looking at cross-sectional assessments, large-scale cross-sectional assessments and ecological assessments, but what really is important for us is to consider what the intervention studies tell us. And this is one of the first ones that I'd really like to present, because this was a study that was done in Kenya on school children. This study was a result of what was the first nutrition innovation lab, actually the nutrition collaborative research support program that was hosted by UCLA in the 80s. And this is a RCT that was conducted by Charlotte Newman and her colleagues in Kenya, where they found that the provision of meat improved growth, cognitive, and behavioral outcomes in Kenyan children. Next slide, please. And what Newman and her colleagues did was they provided 900 children in 12 schools. So these were 12 schools assigned to 4 groups, where one received nothing. The other received a supplement that was a local dish of maize, beans, and vegetables. The third received the same supplement along with a milk supplement, and the 4th received a meat supplement. And what they found was that the children who received the meat supplement had the best Raven scores. Now, the Raven scores are essentially a measure of fluid intelligence, of abstract reasoning and problem solving, as well as reasoning by analogy. So it's a metric that is used for assessing cognitive development in young children. And so what they found very consistently that the meat group had much, much better scores than the other 3 groups. Next slide, please. And in addition to improved cognitive performance, they also had higher levels of physical activity. They showed increased initiative and leadership behaviors, and they had improved lean mass. And the authors concluded that this was associated with the B12, iron, and zinc that was present in the meat supplement. They also did show improved linear growth in the children who received milk, but this was in younger and already stunted children. Next slide, please. And further work done by the same group found an association of the energy and the multiple nutrients that they received or they provided from those animal source foods with both weight and height gain in those kids. And this was very indicative of the fact that the source of energy, protein, and micronutrients from the animal source foods that were provided were critical for the growth and development of these young children. Next slide, please. This one, this is what I'm moving into from the meat and milk supplementation study. I think many of you will be familiar with the egg intervention, providing an egg per day starting at 6 months of age, which the first RCT that was conducted was by Laura Ianotti and her colleagues in Ecuador, where they provided children aged 6 to 9 months 1 egg per day for 6 months of age. And they had a very rigorous, tightly managed study where they monitored morbidity, distributed the eggs, and monitored the egg intakes. This is called the Lulun project. In case you are interested, there is a website where you will get additional information. But if you go to the next slide, I'll show you one of their primary results. what they reported was that the change in LAZ from baseline to end line, and panel B is essentially the egg group, the children who receive the egg. And what you see is that there is a distinct shift and a significant movement to the right of the LAZ score. And so the authors concluded that providing an egg per day along with appropriate social messages translated into an improved LAZ at end line. Next slide, please. However, subsequent to that, when they did a follow-up on those kids who received the intervention, after two years of receiving the intervention, what you see in this slide is they found that the egg intervention effect was no longer present. Next slide, please. But they did find that if the child, if you will, the intervention child had received an egg in the past 24 hours in the Lulun 2 assessment, it was associated with lower growth faltering. Similarly, another study, it's exactly the same design that was conducted in Malawi by colleagues Stewart et al. And their sample size was about over 600 children. They found no effect of egg provision on LAZ, but they did see a significant improvement in head circumference for age. Now, a critical point that was noted in the Mazira trial study was that there was existing fish consumption in the communities where they had recruited these children, because this is along Lake Malawi that the study was implemented. And in addition, they found that the stunting levels at baseline were much lower. Next slide, please. And then, so in addition to looking at type and number of ASFs and comparing the ASFs to each other, there is also the question of what happens if you provide multiple ASFs. And that is being observed in the ecological analyses or the multi-country analyses. But what if you had to look at it from an intervention study perspective? And this is a really new publication by Mahfouz et al. From Bangladesh, where it's called the Bangladesh Environmental Enteric Dysfunction Study, and they provided over 400 children 1 egg and 150 ml of milk for 90 days, and they added a micronutrient mix for 60 days. And they had about 170 children as comparison, and they did see a change in the intervention group. The effect was largest, again, in those children that were stunted. So there's something emerging here about the effect in already stunted children. Next slide, please. And moving on to sort of another outcome of interest, which is head circumference for age Z-score. Now, head circumference is a very simple measurement, and it allows pediatricians to measure or assess brain size and development. It's very interestingly a very simple field-friendly technique, which is not often very used. But one of our colleagues who has been working with the Nutrition Innovation Lab since 2011, Laurie Miller, as a pediatrician, had always included head circumference measurements in her studies. And this particular slide we are presenting is her finding where the head circumference for age Z-score, progressively improved with the number of ASFs provided. So this is an associative analysis. And what she also found was if ASFs were provided, if this intake was in children under 3 years of age, but not in children over 3 years of age. Next slide, please. So we were able to replicate the same analyses that Laurie had done in the Chitwan study. In our study, which was conducted in Banke district in Nepal, called the AFLA cohort study, its main objective was to assess aflatoxin levels in pregnancy and early life and its relationship with health outcomes like stunting. But we were able to use the data on the children, the diet data on children from 6 to 12 months of age, and look at what foods were associated with, what type of ASF was associated with improved head circumference for Z-score. And we found that chicken and dairy were the strongest and most significant associations. And we did find this weird, odd, negative relationship with fish, which unfortunately I don't think we are able to explain, other than the fact that the number of kids who were consuming fish were very small. Next slide, please. So I think in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that there's a lot of literature out there which says ASFs do matter, so there's no question over there. But what I'd like to say is that the causal nature of these relationships is very contextual. And I'm sure I have colleagues on here who would want to talk about the fact that we need to consider the wash, hygiene, sanitation, the dirty chicken environment, if you will, within the context of provision of these ASFs with metrics or outcomes of interest like stunting or head circumference for Z-score, which is around development of children. Keeping all that in mind is very critical when you're trying to understand the causal nature of these relationships. I also think that we're seeing, and we need to see more on number of ASFs as a function of total quantity. I don't think we do enough on assessing total quantity consumed and what exactly, what is the nutrient value of the total quantity consumed. The next thing is the data is showing that type of ASF seems to be a function of geographic location. Introduction of certain ASFs is going to be linked to cultural and dietary practices. And that I don't think is very well studied. And finally, we do need to understand more on the timing and age of introduction, the length of time of consumption, as well as the lagged impacts of consumption of ASF, whether single or multiple. And that particular note, I'm going to hand over to Sonia Zaharia, who's going to talk a lot more about these specific issues. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Shivani. I hope I am on now. Yeah. Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Sonia Zaharia. I'm going to present today our findings from a multi-country analysis on the relationship between animal source foods consumption and child growth. I want to mention that this is joint work with our colleagues from Johns Hopkins University and Makerere University in Uganda. Next slide. Thank you. So our goal was to study how anthropometric outcomes that measure child growth are related with both contemporaneous as well as past consumption of animal-sourced foods. And our target group are children aged between 6 months and 2 years old. And the main difference between our study and existing empirical evidence is the fact that while other such studies use cross-sectional data, we use longitudinal panel data, which means that we observe the same child at multiple points in time. And this is an advantage because it allows us to test for potential lagged effects of animal source foods consumption on child growth. And this is important because child growth is a cumulative process, and we expect that the effects of diet on growth are not necessarily visible right away. Next slide, please. Yes, sorry. So the data that we are using is derived from a series of surveys from 3 different countries. These data were collected at different time intervals. For Nepal, we have yearly data, and the sample is also nationally representative. For Bangladesh, we have data that was collected every 6 months from 3 divisions of southwestern Bangladesh. And for Uganda, the data was collected every 2 years, and we are looking at 6 districts from northern and southwestern Uganda. And these surveys contain detailed information about the household, about the mother and the child. And they also have 24-hour dietary recalls, which we use to determine animal source foods consumption. So what we do is to divide the food items into food groups, and we are using the classification provided by the World Health Organization. So the animal source foods, next slide, please. Somehow the remote control, I don't reach it. I don't know why, sorry. Yes, so here you can see the 4 food groups that we aggregate into animal sourced foods. These are eggs, dairy, flesh foods, and fish and other aquatic products. What you can see in this graph is the share, is for each country, the share of children who consumed a given ASF type in their daily diet. And what you can see is that we have a high heterogeneity across the 3 countries. And Uganda is by far the country where children consume the least ASFs. We can also see that dairy is the most widely consumed animal source foods, except for Bangladesh, where interestingly more than 40% of the children under 2 are consuming in their daily diet some type of fish. But we don't only look at animal source foods, we also take into account these children's diets. Yep, thank you. Next slide. The diets that they have. And here you can see the other food groups that we look at. Nepal and Uganda use the same classification. And for Bangladesh, we have a slightly different classification where fruit and vegetable are all in the same category. And you can see that starchy staples are consumed by most children in the sample, by far the largest category. Thank you. So we are interested in 2 outcomes, the length for age z-score of these children, and whether a child is stunted or not, which is a binary variable. And we want to look at their relationship with contemporaneous as well as past consumption of animal sourced foods. And for animal sourced foods consumption, we look at 2 sets of variables. The first is whether a child consumed any animal source food or not. The second set is whether a child consumed 1 type of animal source foods or whether she consumed 2 or more type of animal source foods. And all these are binary variables as well. And to test our hypothesis, we use fixed effects panel regressions where the unit of observation is a child at time t. And in our regressions, we control for the consumption of other foods, and we also adjust for other confounding factors. So children characteristics as well as relevant household and mother characteristics. And the advantage of having longitudinal panel data is that we can also include fixed effects. So we use district time fixed effects. This allows us to adjust for changing local conditions that are common to all children in a given district at a given point in time. For example, changing market availability or local food prices that would affect animal source food consumption and at the same time the outcome as well. Moving on to our results. Thank you. We start by looking at contemporaneous animal source food consumption, and what we find confirms existing evidence from the literature that those children who consume animal source foods in their daily diet, especially if they consume 2 or more types, have on average higher length for age z-scores. So for instance, in Bangladesh, if a child consumed any animal source food, the length for age z-score will be by 0.12 standard deviations higher than that of a child that didn't consume any ASFs at all. And we obtained similar results for stunting, which I'm not going to show here. These were significant for Bangladesh and Uganda. Next slide, please. Thank you. We also break down the analysis by different food groups. And here you can see that the most important animal source foods in all three countries was dairy. In Nepal, we also find that flesh foods were significantly related to length for age Z-score. And of course, the diet matters as well. And in Nepal, you can see that we obtain significant coefficients on other food groups as well. Now I will move on to our next result. So what happens when, instead of looking at contemporaneous animal source food consumption, we look at what these children consumed in the past? So that means in Nepal, what they have consumed in their daily diet 1 year ago, and in Bangladesh, what they have consumed in their daily diet 6 months ago. And what you can see here is that length for age Z-scores of children who had consumed animal source foods were significantly higher than those of children who hadn't consumed animal source foods. Next slide. Yeah, and our results are similar for stunting. I just want to mention that what you see in this table are not odds ratios. These are fixed effects panel regressions. So we read them like the results of a linear regression. So children who had consumed in the past animal source foods have a lower likelihood of being stunted. In Nepal, the share of stunted children would be reduced by almost 10% if the children consumed any ASFs. In Bangladesh, we have a result if they consumed 2 or more types of animal source foods. And yeah, thank you. So what are we adding to existing evidence? Again, I want to mention that using longitudinal data where these children can be followed up is really valuable, because we can look at both contemporaneous and past animal source foods consumption. And in regressions that I haven't showed here, where we include both contemporaneous and past animal source foods consumption in the same regression, we find that past consumption matters in addition to, and sometimes even more than, contemporaneous consumption. So this kind of confirms our expectation that child growth is a cumulative process, and only after a while we can see the effects on, of diet on growth. And again, we are able to use fixed effects, which allow us to account for any observable or unobservable changing local conditions. So to sum up, what we found is that animal source foods consumption is associated with both higher length for age Z-scores and lower stunting rates. And this confirms existing evidence from the literature. We also found that the association is stronger if more types of animal source foods are consumed. This can indicate a higher diversity of the diet. So animal source foods might be complementing each other, but it can also indicate that there are larger quantities that are consumed, and this makes the effect stronger. Yeah, I haven't mentioned that the dietary codes that we are using have counts and not quantities. So we don't know the quantities eaten by these children. And most importantly, we find that past animal source food consumption matters in addition to, and in some cases, even more than contemporaneous animal source food consumption. Thank you. And with this, I'm going to hand over to Patrick.
Actually looks like Patrick has unfortunately dropped off. We had a giant storm last night in the Boston area, so he has lost power in his house, and that might be the cause of some of these technical difficulties. Shivani, would you mind jumping in and taking over until Patrick is able to come back?
Sure, absolutely. Yes, I don't know, everybody, if I'm going to do justice to Patrick's slides, but I'm going to try. And I think following up from what Sonia has presented, which is sort of a very in-depth, rigorous econometric analysis, we thought we should present some of the published literature that the Nutrition Innovation Lab has produced around agricultural and multi-sectoral interventions and how they may or may not improve the intake of animal source foods, particularly in areas where diets are lacking in diversity. Sonia, sorry, not Sonia, Hannah, next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the first analyses that was done by a colleague of ours, Nasul Kabunga, who was at IFPRI Uganda and who's one of our research fellows, was to look at a national survey, it's a nationally representative survey in Uganda, and assess the relationship of owning an improved dairy cow and improved nutrition. And I think we will be happy to share these papers at the end of the session. I'm sure Hannah can facilitate that. But the key thing that Nasul found in his econometric analyses was that if households adopted the improved dairy cows, they did have an increased milk yield, and they had increased consumption. So it was not just yields and sales, but it was also consumption. And what was very interesting was that those sales raised food expenditures by 16%. And the improved cows, owning an improved cow was associated with lower levels of stunting. But the critical point here was, in the case of Uganda, was that the adoption of these improved breeds was by far in larger farms. So this is that same conundrum again that we land up with, where agricultural technologies often do get adopted, but they get adopted by those that are probably in a higher socioeconomic strata within the context of that rural area. Next slide, please. The second analysis that was done also by Nasul, and this was linked to the evaluation that the Nutrition Innovation Lab conducted for the Uganda Community Connector Project. And this project was conducted in about 25 districts in Uganda, in the north and the southwest of Uganda. And we collected in 6 of the districts where the intervention was implemented in some parts of the district and not in others. So there was a within district control comparison. We had 3 rounds of data that were collected. And what Nasul found was that cropping diversity or production diversity of crops was associated with improved diet diversity score, particularly the consumption of vegetables and meat intake by women. Next slide, please. And then one of the other sets of analyses, and this is unpublished, the previous 2 are published as papers and reports, but this has just been presented in our symposium in Bangladesh. I say just, but it's in December 2019. I think we've kind of all lost track of time with the COVID situation. But what we did find was that households that were engaged in aquaculture did have children more than 2 years of age, older than 2 years of age, that had improved fish intake over time. So they were likely, if they were producing the fish, they were more likely to introduce the fish to the children, and that intake increased over time. And just to contextualize this, that this data was collected from 2016 to 2017 and in 6-month intervals so that we could account for any seasonal differences in intake of different food groups. Next slide, please. And there was also a change in small fish consumption, particularly in those households that were exposed to multiple USAID programs. Now, I'm not going into the details of this, but we were essentially working on this particular analysis and assessment in the Feed the Future zone of influence in Bangladesh, where we were able to retrospectively divide the 4 regions within the future zone of influence into those that were exposed to no USAID program, that is the communities that had never received any exposure, those that had received 1 exposure, and those that had received multiple exposures. And what we find is that these households that had multiple exposures to multi-sectoral interventions had a change in small fish consumption. Next slide, please. Similarly, what we also found that households that had both aquaculture and horticulture engagement had improved household expenditure, not just total, but also household food expenditure, as well as household dietary diversity. Next slide, please. Sorry. Hannah, next. Oh, sorry, I think we missed 1 slide. I think there's one with the egg consumption, Hannah, with Swahara. That's it. Oh, there you go. Thank you. And this is something that Patrick has presented in Nepal as well, where we looked at the production of eggs. And I believe this is work that was done by Prajula Mumi, one of our graduate students, using the data from the Johns Hopkins study portion, where she found that households that did produce the eggs did have an increased intake of eggs in that household, as well as by the children in the household, especially in the poorest of households. Next slide, please. And finally, this is a study, again, this was Laurie Miller's work that was conducted in Nawalparasi, where they provided and this is along with Heifer Nepal, a full package with livestock management plus nutrition education and social capital development activities, along with a partial package which didn't include the social capital activities and the control. And what you find is the weight for height Z-score in kids increased over time. So there's about 900 households and 1,300 kids that were followed over 5 different time points. And I believe it was that same 48-month study that we were looking at the head circumference age Z-score. So in general, what you do find is that a full package of a multi-sectoral intervention, particularly in this case, the work that Heifer Nepal did with Laurie, was linked to a significantly improved weight for height Z-score at the end line. Next slide, please. Oh, all right, sorry. So I think in Patrick's conclusions, and unfortunately I'm not doing justice to this at all, agriculture and what we're seeing from our data and our analyses is that agriculture and multi-sector interventions can increase output and intake of ASFs among both women and children, particularly if they're producing households. And in the case of Nepal, they're seeing if they are especially poorer households, if they're producing those foods, they will be consuming it. And that the increased diet intake is not just from the production, but being able to make market purchases. I think that that's one of the critical points that was also made in our second webinar by Will Masters and Jerry Shively. And I urge you all to look at that webinar online if you haven't, you aren't logged on for that one. And at the end of the day, access to markets is key to both productivity and dietary gains. So on that note, I think I'm going to thank everybody. I believe, Hannah, there isn't another slide. Yes, I think we're open for Q&A. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. So we have a question from Bola Adesogan. What is your explanation for the head circumference response to milk and eggs, but not meat in the Nepal study?
Yeah, so I think thank you, Bola, for a very, very good question. There are 2 different ways of taking this apart. One is that we have to look at, and I'm not sure we have done that analysis, is it because of the number of kids that were introduced to dairy and chicken, they're more likely to be introduced to those foods early in life, because this was about kids who are 6 to 12 months of age. So we need to look at that. That's one, could be an explanation that, you know, they just were not exposed, not that many kids were exposed. But from a nutrient perspective, I think the idea is that there is discussion around the fact that cow's milk, in fact, has growth factors that might be more beneficial or more important for the growth and development of the children. So insulin growth factor is one of these. There are several other sort of non-nutrient components that I have already mentioned about that seem to be in cow's milk that people have speculated about. So I don't have the data to say that that's necessarily, that was what happened here. So we can definitely look at it if it was a function of, you know, just not having much consumption of meat in the diet. So.
All right, and then Naveen would like to know, what's the average egg intake requirement per child?
So I don't think that, so the way this functions would be is, and I think somebody else asked me about how do you know how much ASF to add for complementary food. And I think we have to take a step back and sort of say, what are the needs, nutrient needs of that child, whether it's the calories, protein, fat, and the micronutrients, determine that and then determine what animal source food can be added into their diet, which has to be very contextualized to the country and concern. And that will allow you to determine the actual animal source food to be provided and the amount of the value that it is going to bring to that individual's diet. And I don't know whether I answered that question, Grace. So in general, it seems to me what Lulun and Mazira and some other projects have done is provided an egg per day starting at 6 months of age. So that's like 1 egg a day.
And then Andrea says, should we be measuring cognitive development in our interventions? So where are we, the nutrition community, on this?
Yes, I think that there is discussion that we should be going beyond measuring height for age and stunting, because those are technically proxies of not just that physical development, yes, but it's more cognitive development that is critical. And that we should be looking at metrics of cognitive development, which go beyond head circumference for HC score. And I urge people to look at the articles by Charlotte Newman, where they have utilized different metrics for assessing cognition. I believe that there is an entire field of cognitive psychology that has different tools that can be used for assessing cognitive development in young children and older children. It's a fascinating field, and it's a lecture by itself.
Okay. Then we have a question for Sonia. This is from Nishesh. How were the data on food consumption collected and validated?
Yes, I think I will have to defer this question to Shibani though, because I was not involved in the data collection. So I know the data, but I don't know exactly.
Can you repeat the question?
How were the data on food consumption collected and validated?
Right, so for all the studies, I believe, we have used a 24-hour dietary recall where we assessed, and it's a qualitative recall. So it's a list of foods that the household, if it's a household recall, the mother, if it's the mother's recall or the child, it's usually the mother responding, was requested to provide information for the past 24 hours. And I believe in most cases, there was also a 7-day qualitative recall that was conducted, so that it's a combination of a 24-hour recall and a 7-day recall.
Okay. And then Padmakumar would like to know if there's any indication about animal source food consumption and income elasticity.
And?
Income elasticity.
Oh, Patrick, do you want to grab this one, if you can hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I apologize that my battery died, and I've been scurrying around neighbors trying to find a connection that works. I'm assuming Shivani presented my section. We have not calculated income elasticities and cross-price elasticities. One could go down that route. What we were trying to flesh out at this point, as you've heard, was bring some clarity to the question of which foods matter most, and it's different foods matter in different contexts, depending on levels of pre-existing diet. Clearly, different foods have different effects on growth versus cognition and behavioral effects, especially by age, right? So all of those things were the biological functions we were trying to look at. And importantly, we were trying to make sure, as you heard from Sonia, that we assess the whole diet, so the contribution of other nutrient-rich foods within the diet, so that we're not just saying it's one ASF versus another that matters on its own. It's a variety of ASFs contributing to other diversity and quality within the diet that matters. So we do have, we can look at expenditure patterns, and we do on the different foods versus staples and non-foods, but we've not explicitly calculated the elasticities in this work.
And then Jackson Ifitre from Makerere University would like to know, what could be the explanation for the low consumption of fish in Uganda? Is it related to availability, access, or cultural issues?
Shall I take that, Shabani? I mean, it's high relative to the other countries, but there still seems to be, so two important things are happening in southwest Bangladesh. One is a gradual success and acceptance that aquaculture production should contribute to home consumption. Right? There was, for many years, an emphasis on growing what they call big fish, large fish, carp and so on, for sale in the market, which didn't leave much for home consumption. That's gradually changing with an emphasis on polyculture and small fish production. And where that is happening, we are seeing an increase in home consumption by women and children of small fish in particular, of varying species. So it is happening, but there is still a need for emphasis, SBCC and other communications and education, to introduce various fish products early on after 6 months, and that's only happening slowly.
So Ras says, is there, well, a major challenge for Coolbot, of course, is the cost. Was there any data on ability of users to pay?
Sorry, Grace?
Was there any ability of users to pay? So cost is the major issue for Coolbots?
Yeah. Was there an ability for whom to pay?
For the users to pay.
Yeah. So Patrick, I think this was one of the Q&A questions that had come up, and I had indicated that we've talked about Coolbots as a way to support reduction in waste around animal source foods. And the example is the sort of aquaculture, horticulture project in Bangladesh. And yeah, I think that is one of the key concerns that came up in discussions in Bangladesh, that these school rooms should probably be centrally located in markets, and there needs to be some kind of a model that makes them sustainable, because otherwise they're too expensive. So I'm sorry, I'm answering the question by sending back a point that, yeah, I think we need to have people who are financial and marketing experts develop models so that these technologies can then be implemented, and also people who have an understanding of how the market works on the ground, so that you're implementing these technologies correctly. And then the cost is absorbed into the cost of the product itself. I'm by no means an expert here. I'm a nutritionist, not an expert on these matters, but this is my experience in Bangladesh. I don't know, Patrick, if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, no, I'll just add that yes, refrigeration is not the only way forward, and current electricity-powered methods are out of reach of most, certainly of most farm households. There's progress on solar powered refrigeration, but we need more innovation in that space. But that doesn't mean there aren't other approaches of more rapid drying and careful drying, other means of both protecting and generating value added, especially for perishable products. It's not just fish, it's fruits and vegetables and meats and so on. So the nutrient rich, which are typically the value added commodities with higher prices in the market, we need to spend a lot more time figuring out not just how to encourage their production and their own consumption, but the ability of households who produce more to sell them at high prices at the market. And a lot of USAID and other programs are working in that space. I think we simply have to pay more attention to price of technologies, cost, and scalability in relation to protection of nutrients, not just the production side.
Okay. Alene Kabeta would like to know, so what other interventions shall be included with behavior change communication about consumption of animal source foods? What other interventions will be included?
So I think this is an important question because I just typed an answer to Shiva Bhandari's comment about the fact that, promotion of ASFs, we need to be a little careful because of the fact that we don't want ASFs that are highly processed and packaged, which is one of the issues linked to not just sustainability, but also to the fact that these are linked to poor health and we are dealing with a nutrition transition. So my response to him was that we should really be thinking about messaging that includes good quality ASF. What are the types of ASFs, quantities? And I don't think I made that very clear in my message, Shiva, but I also think it has to be linked to the increasing consumption of fruits and vegetables. So it's a whole diet approach. What we are trying to say here is ASFs do matter because when they're given in really, really small quantities, and I think someone asked me how much, and if the Kenya study gave 60 grams to school children, so that's a very, very small amount. But because they have such high bioavailability with respect to the nutrient base, that a small amount of a good quality animal source food is what should be promoted along with behavior change communications. I don't know if that answers, Grace.
Yeah, I would just add, I think we've all seen programs that have assumed that if productivity or numbers of livestock are increased through some kind of agricultural intervention, that animal source food consumption will increase. And that's simply not a tenable assumption because it depends very much on existing diets, access to markets, and nutrition education. So what we saw, what Shabani showed you in Nepal through a small NGO program by Heifer, the introduction of livestock alone did not see any major impact on child diet or nutritional status. But then adding nutrition education and various components of social capacity development achieved quite significant changes in both diet and nutrition, right? So just making something available, whether it's meat, milk, dairy, or eggs, doesn't automatically mean it will be consumed by the household, but we are finding that where it is available for the household and there is an encouragement to consume, those households that produce more of an egg or a fruit or a fish sell more and consume more within the household. So it is a package that has to be promoted.
Naomi Saville says, I found Laurie Miller's study finding interesting that the intervention with social capital in the full package was the only one that actually had significantly improved WHC by the times of round 4 and round 5. And she said, it's strange that the WHC got worse at those rounds in the other intervention arm. What was the social capital intervention And why do you think this had so much of a strong effect on wasting? So the question is, what was the—
Yes, no, I get it. And thanks, Naomi, for the eagle eye. Between rounds 3 and 4 was the earthquake. And we, in many cases, saw some effect when we were looking in longitudinally at child effects, particularly of younger children. The social capital was actually quite a range of activities, which includes peer-to-peer support, development of savings and credit activities, non-farm income earning by women, a whole range of things, right? So that's essentially my last response was very similar, right? It goes beyond delivering one food. One has to understand the context in which that food can make a greater difference and try and encourage that through multiple forms of intervention.
Chitrakala would like to know, is there any recent study, sorry, I lost it here. Sorry, Chitrakala, I'll come back to your question. It moved a bit. So Mutakwina would like to know, fish is common in Bangladeshi diets and also affordable. What about including fish in child diets to improve nutritional status?
Shabani?
So including fish
in children's diets, yes.
Yeah, I think so. What seems to be coming out, at least from a lot of the work that we've been looking at and that we have done, is that it's really contextual to the environment that you are in. Small fish, for instance, and I just responded to a comment on that, are very high in calcium because of the fact that they're often eaten whole with the bones, particularly in countries like Bangladesh. And if you are able, I believe in Ghana, they have processed fish into fish powder. And so if that can be done, I think that's one way of supporting, adding fish in, particularly for pediatric populations, because you don't want to, bones and all that becomes a bit of a problem when you're dealing with very young children. But I think I would sort of emphasize the need to be local in your solutions. Because I remember having this conversation with Robin Shrestha, who is our colleague from Nepal, our coordinator, and he's from Nepal. And apparently eggs are not necessarily, or chickens, I believe, not eggs, but chickens are not considered a good food in certain parts, and they're not the preferred meat. So I think that I say, yes, you can include fish. I think it's just, you have to make sure that you contextualize it to where you are trying to do that intervention. Patrick, you have something?
Yeah, I see Catherine Ribe talking about fish powder. And yes, there are quite a number of innovations that World Fish have been experimenting with fish powder and the introduction of processed fish in various forms for child complementary foods in Bangladesh and Cambodia and elsewhere. Shakuntala Tilstedt, who's part of our Innovation Lab network, has been doing a lot of work in that space. Others also, ICCDRB has been doing some research in this area. So at some point, there needs to be a connection between researchers and commercial R&D to bring those opportunities together. They won't work unless they are desirable and at a price point that is affordable for very poor households. But there are certainly, obviously, opportunities in countries that are fish friendly, like Bangladesh.
Yeah, and I have to say that I had one of the slides which was on fish and studies that looked at fish consumption and growth. Unfortunately, I think I was running out of time, so I didn't keep that in there. But there is definitely evidence from both Malawi and Zambia of the association of fish consumption and lowered risk of stunting. But there was, many of you might be familiar with Anna Larti's work in Ghana, where she looked at, in the late 90s, she looked at 4 complementary foods in which a cereal legume blend was fortified with, one was, I think, fish powder, and I'm not sure whether the other one milk powder, and the other one was just a cereal legume blend, excuse me. So I'm completely messing this up. But the point I'm making is that what they found was an equivalence that all groups did similar with respect to their length for age Z-score, including the fish powder group. They didn't find any improvements, but that they all sort of were on the same trajectory with respect to growth. So I think that that's a paper from 1999 by Anna Larty and her colleagues. I think it's University of Ghana and UC Davis, in case anyone was interested. So yeah, over to you, Grace.
All right, we have a question from Nishesh Singh. Do you believe putting emphasis on animal source protein puts economic strain on the poor people of developing countries, especially when they're considered high value food and are more expensive? What if we could compare growth in children fed ASFs or growth in children, or I think compared to growth in children fed a variety of plant-based foods?
Patrick, you want me to take this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so I think that, Nishesh, I think that's a very important question. There is, and the paper that I was talking about by Anna Larty was looking at cereal legume blends versus a cereal legume blend that had an animal source food added into it. So there's evidence out there. I think what you realize when you're looking at cereal legume blends is the issue is the satiety factor, but it's also the issue of the amount that a child can consume, particularly in the group that we are looking at is really young children, that they are not able to consume large quantities of that product. And that's why the animal source foods, again, repeating the whole point of its small quantities. And I think that that's one particular point. The other point is that, and there was some discussion in the Q&A, if, I hope you all are looking at it, about the fact that this, yes, there are issues of food safety, there are issues of technology and cooling, there are issues around sustainable production, and issues of the type of animal source foods that you would support. And I think that I urge my colleagues who are livestock scientists on this and who are working in this space to think about how to support climate smart, efficient production that is going to be economic, particularly within the context of the populations we're dealing with. So I know it's a huge tall order, but I think that this is an area of really urgent consideration if we want to think about ASFs as a way forward. We have the evidence that it helps and it works, it's nutrient dense, it has to be packaged in a certain way, but then the question is, how do you scale this up? Is outside the realm of generating the nutrition to ASF relationship. I don't know, Patrick, if you wanted to add that.
No, just on the price issue. I mean, most of what USAID programming is trying to do is promote small scale production of whatever ASF. It's not so much meat, it's really more dairy, eggs and fish. For those smallholder, relatively poor producers to be able to both sell and consume more themselves, right? So the effect that you're looking for is producers to be able to consume more of their own production, so benefit from not just the protein, but all the nutrients, the rate limiting nutrients that may be addressed by nutrient dense ASFs, but also by increasing supply into the market, hopefully bring down prices for those consumers who don't produce those products, right? So the effects that need to be looked at, not just from a farm smallholder household perspective, but by also poor households who go to the market to buy these products. By increasing local supply should hopefully reduce relative prices and allow their effective demand to allow them to consume more. So ideally, you have to look at a population-wide level to understand this.
We have another question from Ahmed Kablan. Can you speak more about how much intensity of nutritional training matters? I remember a similar result in the SHINE study that implied that intensity, that is, how often the trainer visited the household, matters.
Mm.
Um,
Well, I'll let Shabani answer that, but yes, it does matter. I mean, it's not just the number, it's the intensity and the quality of interaction, especially if it's face-to-face or even small group. Absolutely. There has to be a level of trust built up and a level of engagement that makes the messaging not theoretical and abstract, but very practical and actionable. Otherwise, it's wasted. But Shabani?
Yeah, and I think that what you start seeing, and as folks like Patrick, myself, and my colleagues on here, we are researchers that sort of straddle the realm of doing applied studies in the field and working with programming folks who do programming, which is really the real life scaling up of actions, if you will. And what at least my experience has been that when you're doing an intervention study, not necessarily a programmatic intervention, but if you do an intervention like the ones that we presented today, they are very tightly coordinated and monitored. And that sort of shows that data is showing that the more interaction you have and the more rigorous your monitoring is, you're going to see a shift in the behavior or in the use of that particular product or whatever action that you are supporting through your study or your program. So I think to answer Ahmed's question, yes, it does matter, but I think it sort of is on a programming end, when you're talking about the scale, what is the feasibility of having more rigorous and more intensive follow-ups is a question that needs to be answered that is very linked to logistics, finances, logistics, and operations. And I think that is something that's a whole different discussion that should and must be had.
Okay. So Catherine would like to know, she says, I've heard of GOT programs. Do you know how their meat stacks up against beef or poultry with regards to nutrients? I assume they're easier to feed and keep than cows and more practical to sell at the market. So GOT programs.
So I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of this, Grace? GOAT, is it GOAT?
GOT programs, yes.
Yeah, so I have to say, I thought I had gotten all the sort of common ASFs and I obviously missed out on GOAT. So I'm going to say that GOAT is probably somewhere between beef and poultry with respect to the nutrient value. It's, it's going to have the iron, it's going to have the B12 calorically and protein wise. I can't actually say unless I actually look at the data. So I think that they are somewhere between beef, pork, and poultry. Yeah, and I don't know very much about GOAT programs, but maybe folks, other folks might have something to say about this.
Well, we do have goats in many of the households in these countries, but they're relatively small numbers, sheep and goats, obviously, or shoats. But none of the programs we looked at were actively promoting goat productivity or goat ownership. So we could tease out the role of goats as part of the livestock portfolio, but their contribution both to nutrition was quite limited, and they were not part of any of the program interventions that we were looking at.
A few more questions. So Hardy Crooks says, I would appreciate your valuable commentary on the practice of continued breastfeeding in relation to the findings of this study.
Well, I don't think Shabani started by saying the very best animal source food of all is breast milk, and that is what every child everywhere in the world should be consuming for the first 6 months. what we're focused on is that transition period post-exclusive breastfeeding, and to what extent can a different source of food enter into the child's diet in a way that is makes a contribution. So we obviously look at breastfeeding status as part of controlling for the effects that we're looking at. And yes, you do see some extended periods of breastfeeding beyond 6 months, obviously, up as far as a year, sometimes more. But the amounts, the quantities are not easy to gauge. So we just ask mothers, are they still breastfeeding or not? The contribution of breast milk to the child as he or she grows declines over time, obviously, as they grow, as they consume other products. So we're not, you know, it plays a role in birth spacing. It plays a role in continuing the availability of milk to children where milk is absent from their diet from other sources. But we're not coming to any conclusion on a recommendation that X number of months should be considered for exclusive, for continued breastfeeding. Sorry.
Yeah, and you know, just to also add on to that, I kind of realized that I didn't mention this in that second slide where we looked at the composition. What you find is the last column on that slide was actually the intake requirement from complementary foods. So the implicit, and I know that's a cop-out, that the implicit assumption is that these children are going to receive, in addition to continued breastfeeding, X calories from foods. And that was the comparison I was making, that this would be the add-on component to their diet above and beyond the breast milk that they should be receiving. And it's a big discussion and debate to be had. And I know I believe it's the World Breastfeeding Week, or it was last week. I might have lost track of time there, but it is definitely an important discussion that I believe requires its own webinar as to how do you support women continue breastfeeding within, and whether it's rural or urban women, there's so many pressures that sort of reduce her ability to continue. And I think that that's a different discussion altogether, and an important one.
So we have time for just one more question. And that's going to come from Catherine. Were any of these conclusions surprising to you? Because it seems they could have been predicted based on previous knowledge and studies. How can the study participants be helped to actually increase the amount of ASFs in their diets?
Well, what was not known before, and certainly surprising in its strength, was the significance of the lagged effects. By following the same child and looking at prior consumption and of different ASFs and current consumption and change in length for age Z-score, this is a significant new finding. It's not out there in the literature. It's alluded to, but only through cross-sectional data. I think also we have been a little surprised that dairy came out really strongly as the ASF contributing most new nutrients across all three countries. And yet very few of the programs we were looking at were explicitly promoting dairy output. They were more focused on fish and eggs and horticulture. And that matters. And then finally, I would say what really was quite surprising was the strength of our findings, that it doesn't matter if you promote just aquaculture. The significant effects on dietary, in terms of dietary impacts, came through aquaculture combined with horticulture, or egg production combined with legume production, right? So interactions, and I think that speaks volumes to the importance of agriculture programs seeking not just to move the dial on one thing, one animal source food, and not just to overlay nutrition education, but to look at growth limiting nutrients, the problems that are facing the locations in these diets, and how a multi-sector approach can raise all boats, not just for the households producing, but the consumers who are not producing as well. I think all of those are quite new and quite important findings to tell USAID and implementing partners and the host countries.
Okay, so that marks the end of our Q&A session. I'd like to invite all the panelists to say some closing thoughts.
I did already. Over to Shabani.
I think I've been, and so thank you so much everybody for joining us. And just adding to Patrick's point on the, I think the last question you asked us, Grace, was very critical, because it's often we as researchers are so focused on trying to understand the sort of nitty gritty and the nuances, but the bigger picture is out there. And this is just one step towards the bigger picture. So I have to say, Catherine, we may not have answered it the way you would have liked to hear it, but I think what is very critical is that we continue having this kind of a discourse where academic information and findings are presented to folks who are really down on the ground and who are the ones who should ask us those critical questions. So on that note, I thank everybody for joining us, and I'm going to pass it over back to you, Grace, I think, or Hannah. However, I don't know, I'll let y'all figure that out.
Okay, anything from Sonia?
Oh, yeah, so thank you all for joining and listening to us. Also, thank you for the many questions. There are some that we haven't talked about, but I answered in writing, and there are actually some good points for our analysis. So thank you all for being so active.
Okay. And just as a reminder, this webinar is part of a series that the Innovation Lab for Nutrition is co-hosting with USAID Advancing Nutrition. We will have 2 to 3 webinars each month, always on Wednesdays at this time. Next week on August 12th, the Innovation Lab for Nutrition will be presenting on aflatoxins and maternal and child nutrition. To register for any of these events, you can visit nutritioninnovationlab.org or advancingnutrition.org. Recordings and slides for each webinar will be posted on our websites. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Hannah?
Bye.
Thank you.